Hi. This is the Flat 6 modular Arp of Darkness. It's a 26 HP 1U arpeggiator that's quite different from any arpeggiator you've likely used before. In today's video, we'll be looking at the new features being introduced in firmware version 1.3.1, as well as taking a comprehensive look at the core principles of this Eurorack inspiration machine. So what are the new features in this update that we'll be covering today? Queued direct playback mode select, immediate direct playback mode select, queued reset and immediate reset. And then there's the new playback mode based on the Fibonacci sequence called the golden ratio mode. There's a lot to cover, so stick around, but I've also added chapters to the description area of this video, so please feel free to skip around if you're already familiar with the basics of the Arp of Darkness. Alright, let's jump in. So let's get the technical out of the way. What exactly is the Arp of Darkness? Well, the Arp of Darkness is a 1U IntelliGel format Eurorack module that is 26 HP wide. It's truly skiff-friendly at 40 millimeters deep, and it's actually a part of a platform called the Nocturne Alchemy platform, which is an Arduino Nano-based hardware series that the sleight of hand runs on, and that, hint, hint, other free firmwares are coming for pretty soon, that you can literally just flash free firmwares in through the USB port from your computer and change up the functionality of the module. So it takes about 40 milliamps on the positive rail. It has a 1 volt per octave standard. It goes 4 octaves on the CV out. And then it takes plus 5 volts on the input as far as gates for clock. Each module comes pre-calibrated. It does have a calibration mode. If something goes wrong and you lose your calibration settings, you can go in and boot into calibration mode. That's all in the manual. And everything is calibrated to 3/1000ths of a volt. I know, because I do these things by hand. But that's the basis of the Arp of Darkness. Let's patch it up and let's talk about what we can do with it. So let's go ahead and patch up. It's really a simple interface. There's only a clock input and a CV output to the Arp of Darkness. So we want to have a clock source, which in this case is the ornament and crime. And all you have to do is mult your output, the gate output. So we're going to use this mult cable, which the gate from that is going to my Monophonic up here to the trigger input. And then we're also going to mult out from that to the clock input on the Arp of Darkness. Then we take an output from the CV and we bring that up to the Monophonic. That's it. We're patched. So let's take a moment and talk about the clocking functions of the Arp of Darkness. So it's important to point out that the Arp of Darkness has no internal clock. Obviously, that's why you have a clock input. I had mentioned earlier that I'm clocking mine from an ornament and crime. I'm actually using the dual trigger sequencer, a part of the Hemisphere suite. And by default, I'm doing 16 notes in, and you can hear the sequence going. And the way it works is on any rising edge of any gate coming in, it will move forward by 1 note. Standard 16th note sequence. But you can have fun with that, because in Trigger Sequencer, for example, in the Ornament and Crime, I can start removing some gates and creating interesting rhythmic patterns. So have some fun with the Arp of Darkness, because it really is pretty forgiving with what you throw at it as a clock. You could manually trigger it. There's a number of different ways you can do it, but it doesn't always have to be straight 16th notes. The Arp of Darkness is different than most arpeggiators. What makes it so different from arpeggiators is how a typical arpeggiator functions is you will hold down however many notes in a chord, let's just say these 3 notes in a chord, and it will arpeggiate or play individual notes from that chord in a direction. On the Arp of Darkness, the keyboard is monophonic, so how you input notes is by playing them one at a time like this. You can do it quickly, but it's still technically monophonic. Another way that it differs is how notes are recorded. On a classic arpeggiator, the notes only continue to play as long as you're holding them down, unless of course it's latched. The Arp of Darkness, however, is a lot different in the fact that it's more akin to a shift register or even a Turing machine, is because it uses a buffer to fill with notes and it sequences from within that buffer. So on the left-hand side, this potentiometer shows you 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 16. Think of it as the buffer are containers. And so if we start out with 3-note container, then we can throw 3 notes into that buffer. What's interesting about a buffer, though, is when you throw the 4th note in, the first note drops off. And so now it only plays 3 notes. And you can move up to 4, 5, 6, 8, or 16. But that concept is really important to get used to with the Arp of Darkness. It's part of what makes it so creative. So if we start playing, currently the buffer has no notes in it. And we're going to hear a tone. That's just our the Manus Eteritas just playing whatever pitch it's at. We're going to go ahead and we're going to enter 1 note. So what's happening is we only have 1 note in a buffer of 3, but it will loop until the buffer fills up. And so we can add another note, and then a 3rd note. Now the buffer's full. If I add a 4th note, that first low C that we had will drop off. Let's do... And that's how you enter notes in a creative fashion. It's really quite playable. So you can also change octaves. I should note that these buttons aren't transposing the existing sequence. Instead, they're shifting the octave for new note entry across the 4-octave range. All the way back down. Now we can also change the buffer length on the fly, and how this works is you turn the potentiometer to the value. I'll just go ahead and turn it to 5, and at the end of the sequence that's playing, so at the end of that buffer of 3 notes, it will then switch to a buffer of 5. Now this is important. It doesn't automatically fill it with 5 notes. We now have 5 notes available to us, which we can add on. And then the buffer will become full and things will start dropping off again. But let's do... So now we're at 5. We can go all the way up to 16, and we can switch between octaves while we're doing this. So we're individually adding and evolving the sequence as we go, filling the buffer. So when we turn the buffer back down, let's say we go to 6. Now it's repeating the 6 notes. If I go back up to 16, it's actually removed anything above 6 notes. So we can rebuild again. And that's what makes the Arp of Darkness so interesting. You're evolving sequences, you're kind of staying ahead of it, and it can be a lot of fun, and it can be an inspiration machine. The Arp of Darkness has 6 different playback modes: forward, backward, exclusive ping-pong, inclusive ping-pong, golden ratio mode, which is unique to the Arp of Darkness, and random. You can cycle through these playback modes by simply selecting the octave up and octave down button at the same time, and it will move to the next playback mode. For example, if we start out in forward, press the buttons, backward, exclusive ping pong, inclusive ping pong, golden ratio mode, which we'll come back to more in depth later, random. Press it one more time, and you're back in forward. So in addition to being able to cycle through the different playback modes in the Arp of Darkness, new to version 1.3.1, I'm excited to introduce the ability to directly select playback modes by using the octave up and octave down button as kind of a shift button. And the keys, each one are assigned a different function in a pattern that's fairly easy to memorize. So how this works is the octave up button is a cued shift selector, and the octave down button is an immediate shift selector. So easiest way to explain how this works is we'll go ahead and go through the modes. We have forward, backward, exclusive ping pong, inclusive ping pong, golden ratio mode, which, trust me, we're going to get to that, and random. And so what you do, it's a long press on the octave up. We're going to start with cued shifts, and it's basically a count to 1/1000. It's about 1 second, about that. It's pretty forgiving. But you press and hold that, and then while holding it, you select the mode that you want to go into. And what it does is it cues the mode, meaning if you're midway through a sequence, it will wait till the end of the sequence and switch to playback direction on the end of the sequence. It's the same thing with the red, except it happens immediately. But the easiest way to show this is with an ascending scale. So I've got a 16-note ascending scale. Right? We're in forward currently, which is this. And we're going to shift to backward, but we're going to do it midway through by cueing it. And then it comes backwards. Exclusive ping pong. Inclusive ping pong. You'll hear the notes on the ends. Duplicate. And of course, golden ratio mode. And then random. And then we want to go back to forward. Now, the red button does an immediate shift, and so obviously you kind of have to do this in sync if you want it to sound good, but hey, we're all a little impatient sometimes and we need to make it happen yesterday. So with the red, we're going forward currently. I want to make it go backwards immediately. And I can make changes on the fly instantaneously. So I'm really excited to introduce this because I think it's going to add a lot to the playability of the instrument, especially in a live situation. And we'll see where we go with it from here. Another new feature being introduced in version 1.3.1 of the Arp of Darkness firmware is the ability to reset the sequence. This is something that a number of folks had asked for, so I implemented it in a similar fashion to the way that you manage the playback modes. And it's the same thing. You have a cued shift and an immediate shift button. And you have your playback modes kind of all up along the top here. Your high C is now a reset button. And this works in stopped mode if you have everything in your module patch kind of set to go from 1. When it's stopped, you can just simply hold shift and hit reset and it'll reset it. But let's go ahead and back to our sequence, our ascending sequence. And I'll throw a kick drum on this one. And I'll show you how this works because 1 is cued and that plays at the very next gate. So it keeps you pretty closely in sync. The red one is an immediate. As soon as you hit the reset button, it resets. For those of you who are like, you're not going to keep me on the grid, man, this is jazz. That red button's for you. So let's see how this works. So we have our ascending sequence. Press and hold. Right? You have your reset. And then you can do immediate. And so there's creative use. And so there you have it. You now have a reset function. Another new feature that's available in the Arp of Darkness firmware 1.3.1 is the golden ratio mode. We mentioned it a few times earlier in the video. Let's go a little more in depth into that. So what is it? Well, in golden ratio mode, the sequencer calculates the next step using a unique algorithm based on the fractional part of the golden ratio, the Greek letter phi, approximately 0.618. Instead of moving from one note to the next in a linear or strictly random fashion, this mode calculates each subsequent step based on its current position, multiplied by its fractional value. The result is a pattern that progresses in a way that feels both intentional and organic. I mean, let's face it, it's math, and math is beautiful. But that's in theory. I would encourage you to try out the golden ratio mode and see what you think, because every time I play with it, I end up getting a little carried away with it. So let's go ahead and listen. What I've got here is just 6 notes. Upward motion. Pretty repetitive. Now I can go into random if I want to mix it up. This is random. It's kind of all over the place. Maybe a bit too much for me. Let me go back to forward. Golden ratio mode, on the other hand, it's not random. If you listen closely, you hear a pattern, and you hear it evolving. And man, it's got a groove. In fact, it's got the kind of groove that maybe you want a kick drum on it? Now we're talking. Maybe Manus Territas needs a little more something. Uh-oh. Oh, Manus Territas, baby. Thanks, Noise Engineering. Is there anything that kicks harder than a Moog sub? Now we're talking. Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm feeling that. That's the Arp of Darkness.